Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar, which we're holding in partnership with IBM. I'm Marta Kozlowska, Development Director at the Energy Institute. For those of you who might not know, the Energy Institute is an independent network of professionals spanning the entire energy system. Convening and facilitating debate, we bring together expertise so that energy can be better understood, managed, and valued. And so, working with our members, we help the industry to tackle urgent challenges. The current crisis is having a profound impact on operations, and the industry must now focus on the bottom line, which our speakers will discuss in a moment. I'd like to welcome all our panelists, and in particular, I have pleasure in introducing the chair, Vice President and Fellow of the Energy Institute, Dr. Vivian Cox. Vivian has had a very accomplished career, including 28 years at BP, and for the last 10 years, she's held a number of chair and non-executive roles, including as chair of Vallourec, non-executive director with GSK and with Stena, and senior independent director at Pearson. Previously, she's held non-executive director roles with Eurotunnel, with Rio Tinto, and BG Group. Very deservedly, Vivian was made commander of the British Empire. She's deeply involved in the work of the Energy Institute, and we are really very privileged to have her here today as our chair. Vivian, over to you.
Thank you, Marta, and let me add my own welcome to you all. This is a really relevant topic, I think, because our energy industry is facing not just one, but two crises at the moment. And operational resilience is going to be critically important. And the first crisis, of course, is the pandemic, and that required every company to adjust the way in which it worked. Of course, health and safety of employees was the primary consideration, but also we had to keep essential infrastructure working. I was talking to somebody from National Grid who was telling me how they've had to bring in temporary accommodation so that they can keep workers on site in order that they can keep transmission and distribution working. We've seen the difficulties of getting crew changes on tankers because we can't move people around the world as easily. We've seen in refineries changes to shift patterns and workflows to keep people safe. So there have been a number of operational changes that have been required to cope with the pandemic. So that's the first crisis. But of course, the second crisis, and one which is likely to last much longer, is actually around the low oil price environment. We've seen demand cratering. I think it was April the 20th when WTI traded negative for the first time ever. And so companies are having to respond very, very quickly to that crisis. But of course, going into this crisis, a number of companies have been making very significant shifts to move their business, make their business more sustainable, and to move it towards low carbon business models. And this is something that Peter will talk about during our panel session. For me, it's absolutely essential that energy companies continue to make that shift. And so the challenge is to be able to continue to do that in an environment of low prices. And of course, in that environment, sustaining the balance sheet, preserving cash is going to be important. We've already seen some companies declaring bankruptcy. Chesapeake, who was, I think, the second biggest gas producer in the US, declared bankruptcy a couple of weeks ago. And so what we're going to see is oil companies responding as they've done before, the last time in 2014, by reducing discretionary expenditure. So reducing capital expenditure around exploration and production, reducing expenditure on research and development, and looking at every single cost which is not a safety critical item and finding ways to reduce. Unlike in 2014, though, many of the companies in the supply chain, the oil and gas supply chain, have not recovered from the previous crisis. And I think there will be fewer opportunities to gain savings from that supply chain. Liquidity is going to be critical, and so of course there will be a focus on cash and particularly on working capital reductions. And I know companies that are taking the opportunity to establish a zero-base approach to working capital, looking at every single dollar of working capital to see how it can be modified or reduced. And there is also the opportunity to accelerate digitization and automation, and probably more opportunity now than there was in the last crisis to make fundamental changes to the way in which we work and the way in which we use data. And that's also something we will talk about during the panel session. So it's not clear when or if demand will recover to the same levels that we saw before this crisis. But I think what is clear is that the successful companies are going to be the ones that come out of this crisis leaner, more agile, more technology enabled, but also more sustainable. And that is the challenge that we face as an industry. So I'm going to move now to the panel session. We're very fortunate to have our 4 panelists with us. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and just make a few remarks around what they're seeing and how they're seeing companies responding. And then we'll open it up to your questions. And I do ask you as many questions as possible, please, and we will try and get through them all. So the first panelist, let me introduce you to Myrtle Dawes. She is the Solution Centre at the Oil and Gas Technology Centre. Myrtle, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Vivian. Hope you can all hear me. I'm delighted to be speaking to you today. And I am the Solution Centre Director at the Oil and Gas Technology Centre. And our mission has been to unlock the full potential of the UKCS from a technology perspective. We are keen to anchor and grow a diversified supply chain, again, using technology. And probably the one that's closest to a lot of our hearts as well is around inspiring a culture of innovation, especially in terms of energy transition. So we were established in 2016 under the Aberdeen City Region deal under a similar circumstances without the pandemic. So again, you know, this is somewhat cyclical, what's been happening here, but far more severe. So I think I'm going just to take you through some of the things that we've been seeing. So I think the first thing to say is that the consensus, as with everyone, is that COVID-19 has been very painful, and in some instances has been quite has affected the existence of quite a few of the companies. To be fair, it's also apparent that it's not been consistent across the industry. And we've got 150 approved live projects at the moment. We've been taking data since the pandemic and assessing what's been going on. And I'm just going to give you some insight into that. So what we've seen on the cost side is that at least 20% of our projects are going to experience a medium to high cost escalation due to various reasons, the delays, the additional measures that need to be taken. From a supply chain perspective, we found that 15% of the companies have had to go for alternative equipment, in particular where developers have been sourcing, say, from China for some of their robotics. They've had to source elsewhere, or they've actually lost that supply chain. From a field perspective, what we like to do is to test technology in the field. And what we've had there is 30% of these field trials or the lab work has either been cancelled or subject to an indefinite delay, as operators themselves are obviously grappling with the fact that they've had to reduce their activity. And then finally, from a schedule perspective, we see around 47% of our projects either having an indefinite delay as they try to get back into schedules, or indeed having some kind of cancellation. So indeed, I think it has been quite significant. But I think in terms of the trends that I could say, there is reduced and uncertainty activity levels. So we are expecting there to be fewer field trials. But what this will have in terms of an impact is a lower opportunity for commercialization and lower levels of industry support as people tune back some of their R&D spend. And what we've seen from a good perspective is that some of the developers are actually being very agile and being able to either transfer skills or products to some of the other sectors, including the wider energy sector, food, beverage, and health. And then finally, we just say that opportunities do remain because technology is seen as an enabler for the COVID-19 recovery, as well as enabling recovery by accelerating green transition. So the other question that's been asked is, where is the money being spent? And we're just going to give two areas. I mean, we are a funded organization, so we work in partnership and collaboration with industry and government. And from an industry perspective, the common themes we have is that obviously the pandemic response is the primary response in terms of health of teams. I think the second one is, how do they return to safe, efficient operations post the pandemic? And the third one is around making sure that they keep the strategic intent, so they narrow what they're looking at, but make sure the strategic intent is met. And for some of these companies, that's net zero and diversification alongside shareholder value. I think from a government perspective, I think they've been very open. They are looking for a green recovery, incorporating inclusiveness and community well-being. They are looking for jobs and projects which will yield that, but really those which are shovel ready. And they are also looking for those projects from a technology perspective which will ensure that we get energy transition supply chain in the UK, as well as anchoring the IP value here as well. So that's the trends that we've been seeing from the developer perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Myrtle. Thank you very much. And let's move on to the next list. Jeremiah, who is Global Leader for Maintenance, Repair and Operations at IBM. Jeremiah.
Yeah, so good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jeremiah Woodford. I work with IBM, or work for IBM. We cover a very specific product that's very relevant in today's times with COVID. Our solution and what my teams do globally is we support, we take large data sets from most of the super majors. We're working with most of the asset intensive industries like mining, oil and gas, power generation, utilities. The general premise is that we're mining their data sets from their ERPs and their EAM, their maintenance systems, to help them determine, are their stocking levels for their spare parts correct? And now before COVID hit, a lot of the super majors' main focus was production and uptime, and that was a key focus for our product. But one of the key strategies we're seeing today is because of those practices, production and uptime, and a lot of operation in remote parts of the world, a lot of bloated inventory levels have been created around the globe. And this is affecting their balance sheets majorly, lots of invested capital sitting out there. And right now, we're really working with most of our customer base, especially in the upstream oil and gas, downstream as well, but mainly a lot of in the upstream oil and gas is, from a production standpoint, how do we leverage what you have? How do we reduce and free up that working capital? And that's essentially what that's really the heart of what our solution has been doing for years now. But now with IBM acquired us a couple of years ago, and now with the larger IBM organization, we've been able to essentially add in a lot of the bigger data sets and AI capabilities IBM brings to the table to mine and ultimately expand this so we can really support customers around the globe that are operating in some of the most remote parts of the world. The general premise of what we see, I think is the easiest way to articulate this. So this is an example of a super major that we've been working with for a number of years now. And as we've gone through downturns with them, we've helped them change their strategy. I think this, at least from my experience, I live in Houston, Texas, worked in the oil and gas industry for all of my career. This is the worst that I've seen it. Like Vivian said, going negative for WTI was kind of a panic mode. And so what do you do? How do you adjust this? And what we're doing right now for a major factor is, so we're mining these large data sets. So if what you see in this graph is 786 million in total inventory globally they're sitting on. This is inventory that they have to support production for all their spare parts and safety stock. So what we do is we're able to generate a forecast. And in this forecast, we can show that they had $20 million of spare parts that, based on usage and consumption and maintenance activities, they're understocked, that could shut them down. But this is key. In past, before something like a COVID would hit, they would accept some of these reports and then actively go buy that material. But what's crucial here is looking at that and preventing that spending of that 20 million to see if other regions have an excess that can be transferred, or maybe in certain cases, for this customer in particular, they were shutting some of their wells down. So we want to make sure that we don't trigger any type of reorders, especially if production is non-existent at some of these wells. And then furthermore, really the biggest piece here is that we identify almost $40 million of active stock, essentially lowering their min-maxes and reorder points on some of this inventory, and then running down the inventory that they currently hold. So it's going from a 786 million to 751 million, and that's a 12-month period. So that it is significant monies to be saved. And then one of the big transitions I'll leave you guys with is, if you see the last blue bar, 142 million, this is a transition from the traditional way of doing business in upstream oil and gas with joint ventures. You're stocking per assets with joint ventures. We do have the ability to help them regionally stock per the region for the assets for very expensive critical spare parts. Now, this is a much harder feat to do, and there's a lot of challenges around this, but there's significant changes to be had if these oil companies can really wrap their head around and invest to change the way they operate today. So these are some of the initiatives that we're working on now.
Thank you very much, Jeremiah. We'll move on now to the third of our panelists. John, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again to everyone at the Energy Institute for this opportunity. One of the areas that I wanted to talk about today was really around how we're starting to see the use of technology to respond, particularly to the crisis and also the kind of lower oil prices. The rise of technology and the kind of digital transformation in our industry has been underway for a number of years now, but COVID has certainly started to accelerating this. And I wanted to just give a quick example of one of the areas where we've seen a kind of very immediate kind of use case and example start to come to life. If you kind of step back and look at how our industry kind of works today, you'll see a lot of kind of processes and ways of working that really haven't changed much since the 70s, even say since I was born. I go to construction sites, I see plastic T cards on the way in, paper-based forms, people taking readings with a piece of pen and paper from instruments, paper-based drawings and kind of documents being carried around assets and construction sites. And it just seems really quite kind of antiquated. And certainly when we started talking to a number of our kind of people on assets, one of their kind of big observations of how do we get technology into our sector was, well, we need a digital kind of working experience, much like we have in our everyday lives. We can do our banking online. I can control the thermostat, the security cameras from an app on my phone. I can access all my photos, my music. I can track my health, my fitness, just with maybe a wearable technology, but just apps on our phone linked to other things. And as we were looking at this and thinking about, what would that digital experience for our kind of workforce kind of look like, COVID really started to hit. And we were thinking quite rapidly around what would the implications of that be and how would we need to respond. And particularly, how do you assure the safety and obviously the mobilization of people, particularly to offshore assets in the UKCS, to make sure you get the right people on board, maximize, obviously you've got a limited number. We've been running at about 50% of beds being used to kind of keep social distancing. How do you maximize that amount of bed space whilst ensuring that everyone is actually safe, aware of all the latest guidelines, and if you can in the process, improve the efficiency and productivity. So if we try going to the next one. Nope, not playing. There you go. So what we did was actually kind of start and say, right, if we had an app for that, the original kind of Apple advert, what would that app look like? So we designed from scratch an application. We put it together in really a matter of weeks for the initial version that basically puts an app into the hands of the workers that we'd be deploying, that provides them effectively a communication portal where they can see the information on their mobilization. So which hotel to turn up to, which heliport they're going to be flying from, on which flight. If any of those kind of details change, particularly if things like health and safety information changed or information about kind of COVID-19 protocols, we could push them a notification. We could see on our desktop version that notification has been sent, it's been received, and it's been read. And actually we had a functionality in the app where the person has to acknowledge it as well. So we can get that kind of full chain of assurance. And actually be able to use that then as an in-the-pocket communication advice, which means that we used to have an administration team in our office in Aberdeen who'd literally be on the phone and emails 24 hours a day trying to contact all these people and trying to manage and juggle all of this. Whereas now that admin team are much more capable of, one, doing that job from home, and two, it's a far more efficient process that's a lot more kind of involved and interactive with the people that are actually working. And we've managed to roll that out once we kind of got a full kind of industrialized ready version that we could get up in the App Store. We got that out to about 1,500, it's over 1,500 now, workers in the North Sea, so that we had that kind of much stronger line of communication. This is just one example of how applying technology, which is ultimately the norm in the rest of our kind of lives, in our kind of social lives, in the rest of our kind of daily lives, and starting to apply it into situations and use cases in an oil and gas sector that we've certainly seen has been a massive acceleration. And there's obviously significant value associated with that, both from a safety and assurance side with our workforce, but also from a cost and efficiency side from how we run those contracts. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to talking more about how we're seeing other areas in which technology is improving and is adapting to this current situation.
So our final panellist, we're moving now to Peter Mather, former colleague of mine at BP. He's the Group Regional President for Europe and the Head of Country for the UK. Peter, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Vivian. You can hear me all right? Just check. So I am sparing you any slides today, but I thought I would just give you 4 or 5 minutes sort of insight into how we're looking at things in a large company right now. And I think, Vivian, you teed it up very well when you talked about the various crises. And it is certainly the most extraordinary period I've ever known in my career. So I'll just give you a little bit of context and I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing. But the context for us is actually on February the 12th, before COVID and before the very low oil price levels that we talked about, we announced a very new ambition for the company. We announced basically that we would be heading for a net zero across our operations on an absolute basis by 2050 or sooner. And effectively, we said we'd do that with scope 1 and 2, so net zero our own operations, and also net zero for the production, the oil and gas production that we put into the marketplace. We also announced a 50% reduction in the carbon intensity of the products that we sell, so that we buy in and sell out at retail sites, etc. We also committed to methane measurement in a much more precise way and reducing the methane intensity of our operations by 50% by 2023. And rather surprisingly, I suppose, for an oil and gas company, we also announced very clearly that we would be increasing the proportion of investment into our non-oil and gas businesses over time. We also said we wanted to work with others to get to net zero, so advocate for policies such as carbon pricing. We actually now incentivize our workforce around their pay to do with our emissions performance. We've been very clear that certain trade associations we will consider exiting if we don't believe that they are representing our views adequately. Very much signed up to the recommendations of the TCFD, which is about transparency of reporting in terms of the environmental aspects and others of your performance, and also launching new businesses to look at working with cities and regions. So a very exciting agenda. And then along comes, first of all, well, it's almost simultaneously a pandemic that we've never seen before in our lifetimes, and of course a monumental crash in the oil price, and coupled with the pressures we've been under for a while around global activism, clearly, and governments looking to accelerate the energy transition. So it's a sort of perfect storm of monumental proportions, perfect hurricane in some ways. Well, so what are we doing? Well, I think the key thing is that we are not turning away from the 10 aims, from our net zero commitment, from the things that we said on February the 12th. We're not turning away from that. If anything, we're probably accelerating. It's probably amplifying and accelerating what we're doing in that space. There's a lot of talk about building back better or building back greener. And I think that is absolutely what companies like mine will be doing. I mean, we are having and we have had an enormous shock, and I think that will definitely be a catalyst for probably faster change. The last financial crisis, just around 2008, probably set the cause of climate change backwards. It probably decelerated the energy transition, and I think what we're now seeing is that this current crisis will accelerate it rather than decelerate. We are unfortunately having to cut costs. We've announced around about a 25% reduction in our workforce that we're just working through now. That is on top of a reorganization anyway that we're doing as a result of our new aims and our new strategy. And so that is painful, but we're also clearly looking at some portfolio adjustments. You wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that. Inevitably, at times like this, we need to prune a little bit, and particularly look at the bits of the portfolio that are best managed by others, where others can see more value. And I suppose the most recent example of that was the sale, Vivian, you know this business well, the sale of our petrochemicals business to INEOS. Very sad to see that go, but yeah, INEOS is an enormous and highly successful petrochemical focused company. And I think as BP, we realized we just had to focus in on our pure kind of energy business, both oil and gas and new energies going forward. And of course, we're working closely with our supply chain. We're working, I mean, some of the things that have been said by my colleagues so far, by Myrtle, by Jeremiah and John, of course, apply very much to BP. So we need to lift up every stone, because now is the time over the next few years that companies like mine will need to really establish themselves in the energy transition. And frankly, I think BP, other companies too, will look very different in 5 to 10 years' time. And I think they'll look better, and I think they'll be very exciting places to work. So I'll leave it at that for now, Vivian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to all of our panelists. And I just encourage you to post your questions. If you have questions for the panelists, by clicking on the chat icon, type a question, it'll come to me, and then I will distribute to the panelists. But I'm going to start actually where Peter finished. And I'm going to ask the question to John, first of all, but other panelists can join in. Are we going to be able to attract the talent that we need into this industry? Because there are a lot of people out there who say dirty oil and gas, finished industry, not an exciting place to work. Peter made the comment that he thought it would be exciting. How do you find it? How are we going to attract the talent we need?
Yeah. So, when I came into this industry, part of the attraction was, big, complex engineering projects in far-flung places of the world, very complex, very big kind of capital budgets. I think the value proposition to people coming into the industry now has changed slightly. Yes, there's still big, complex capital kind of projects and operations in the oil and gas side. But actually, I think as an industry, we have an enormous role to play in driving the energy transition, and the likes of BP and others are absolutely at the forefront of this. We've got all of the skills, all of the capability, and frankly, all the financial kind of firepower to actually make a very, very material difference in this space. And frankly, I don't think there are many companies like BP out there who are setting as bold an ambition to make as bigger impacts in driving the energy transition. So I think a huge part of our value transition to the next generation of workforce has to be the role that we're able to play in driving that change and solving one of the world's kind of biggest problems. I think a second kind of element to that then is also that as an industry, we're embracing technology. This isn't the kind of the oil and gas industry of 20, 30 years ago, which is kind of stuck in the past. This is far more dynamic, diverse place to work with far more kind of technology bleeding into everything we do. And we were saying at Petrofac the other day, every single graduate that comes through the door doesn't even have a basic level of coding. It's probably got quite advanced coding skills off the back of their university degrees. And yet, as soon as they come into the building, we tell them almost to forget that and get back to being a draftsman, get back to kind of doing some basic engineering, basic project management, using tools that are kind of 20 years old. And we've kind of said that, look, that's just not going to work. That's not attractive going forwards. We've got to leverage that kind of technological understanding, actually put it to work and embrace it. And there's enormous value we've already started seeing in deploying that technology in our business and for our clients as well. So for me, the combination of being an energy transition leader and being a really fast adopter in digital technology, hopefully makes us a more attractive place and a sustainably attractive place for talent to work in the future.
Right. Thanks. Would any other panelists like to add to that?
Can I just come in briefly, Vivian, having raised the point? I mean, if you like solving problems, what bigger problem is there to solve than the future of the planet, frankly?
Yeah.
And I would say to anybody, it doesn't necessarily have to confine itself to engineers, even though we need engineers, but we need people that understand consumer behavior as well. We need digital experts. We need a whole range of skills to solve this problem. And frankly, I can't think of anything more interesting and stimulating and important than trying to make sure we can keep the planet, mobile and lit and heated in a sustainable way. And yes, we will have to reskill a little bit. I mean, subsurface expertise might be shifting more to carbon capture and storage and understanding, the formations into which we're going to put CO2 in the future, for example. And digital skills are going to become more and more important, clearly across all these sectors. But all I would say is, look, I just think it's absolutely fascinating and the biggest challenge we've got. So, yeah.
Thanks, Peter. I absolutely agree with you. And I pick up on that last point about digital. Jeremiah, what do you think the next trends, the next developments are going to be in the use of data and AI and so on? You're on mute, Jeremiah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, great question. There's a huge movement for AI, and I think it's a catch-all term. And machine learning, I think there's a lot of there's a mass force behind it right now, and I think there's a lot of people that have a lot of high hopes for it. And I think there are some great aspects coming out of it. I think people need not be afraid of it. AI is still kind of a dumb machine, But what that dumb machine has the ability to do is mine massive amount of data, unlike a human, and make some sense of it. But it's all on how well you program those algorithms to learn from that. So what we're seeing a lot of the trends right now is how can we save on processes, on where we are executing, where we're spending money, where capital is being initiated out. What can we do better? And we know these massive companies, super majors like BP, who's on the phone today, are generating large data sets. They've invested lots of capital in systems, ERP systems, maintenance systems to track these data sets. Now we need to make sense of those data sets. And just as our former CEO, Ginny Romano, said, data is the new oil. And that's what we're really trying to make sense of today, is where can we tap into those data sets to benefit and do more with less. And as of right now in these downturns, unfortunately, we're having less people. So we really got to be able to tighten our belts and try to trend some of this data sets, like what we're doing with the supply chain, reducing and leveraging the materials that companies like BP have invested and bought, very high dollar, very expensive, critical spare parts. Let's make sure you have enough, but let's leverage what you've already bought and not buy unnecessarily more, which has been a big trend for years in this industry.
Great, thank you. And there's a question from one of the participants, which is actually asking how you'll find the adoption of these new technologies in the industrial processing part of the industry, where it's difficult to make sudden changes. Are you seeing there are opportunities there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are seeing, I would say the last 6 months is I've had more conversations with executives in this industry ready for change, knowing they have to change. A lot of bad practices that have haunted this industry, they know no longer can be happening. And there's a lot of things that we've known for a very long time that other industries have had to adopt. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing we're having great discussions and actually starting some movement on a lot of this with some of the super majors on changing their behaviors, want the initiative to change on how they execute business and being more nimble.
And I think maybe, Vivian, if I can just kind of echo that as well. I mean, we've got a number of these types of applications deployed in industrial settings. So, and we had fears when we started putting kind of connected worker platforms, kind of tablets with digitized workflows or helmet mounted tablets with digitized workflows into the hands of operators on assets kind of offshore the UK. We were worried that there would be kind of resistance to doing that. And actually, the reaction from the workforce that we've seen has been enormously positive. They've taken it for what it is, that it actually makes their job easier, allows them to concentrate on the more kind of value-adding, complex, interesting parts of it, and takes away a huge amount of the kind of the dullness of kind of writing up reports at the end of it, for example. And they think they're the workers of the future, and actually they grabbed it with both hands and really embraced it. And ditto, we've got an AI and machine learning application live on an asset in the North Sea, which is predicting the performance of the equipment and predicting 10 days and sometimes more when parts of that equipment down to the component level will actually fail, and allowing us therefore to drive the cost down on the asset and the uptime up. And again, we thought there would be huge resistance, huge skepticism. That asset's now been kind of running with that system for about 9 months now. And to begin with, every kind of insight that the algorithms were generating was questioned with enormous detail. Why is it saying that? This can't be true. And as soon as they took the compressor offline, looked at the component, is the dry gas seal going to fail? Well, actually, yes, it is. And we're building up that kind of comfort level that the insights that it's generating are true, that they're really happening, and it's allowing us to really, they're seeing now a step change in their uptime performance as a result. And so I think for me, one of the kind of big next trends will be going from MVPs, small use cases, small rollouts across an asset or two, to actually driving the deployment of some of these solutions across BP's whole portfolio, for example. If there's one asset that's getting, a 200% increase in their productivity offshore, why isn't every asset in BP getting that same productivity increase? Or why isn't every asset getting a 5% bump on their uptime? That's an enormous value. And yet at the moment, we're still slightly kind of conservative and tentative about how we're rolling these solutions out. And I'd like to hope that, the big change in the next few years will be acceptance and then, mass scale kind of rollout and delivery of a lot of these solutions.
Brilliant. And it's really encouraging actually to hear how much the industry is prepared to embrace change. And sometimes it takes a good crisis to make that happen. Myrtle, I wonder from your perspective whether you're seeing different forms of cross-industry happening.
So surprisingly, absolutely, and cross-industry, cross-sector, and I think some of the normal conservatism in terms of I don't have a model, so I can't really speak to you or get business done, is not off the table, but it's been paused a bit so that we can collaborate before we compete. So, in OGTC, working with industry, but, we are doing something really exciting, which is cross-sector with wind in terms of, how we are going to electrify our platforms, how can we develop green hydrogen together. But we've got also others. We're working with TNO, so the cross-border collaboration is very strong as we look at the energy of the future and realize these are global problems and we need sometimes regional solutions to this. We need to make sure that we've got we can harness the energy from where it is. So from our perspective, we're seeing that. We're also looking at energy hubs, which are really involve many groups across the whole value chain, from the distributor of energy to the producers of the energy and those in the middle. We're now seeing us all sitting down and talking in the same room. Somewhat, we've had to adapt our language so we can understand each other and wonder why we never talked before. But it's quite amazing when you start talking to them of something that was completely like a wall, you realize didn't really matter to the other side. They just didn't know it was a problem to you. So, and I've been actually quite humbled by how much people really actually want to get on, especially on I'd say on energy transition. And some of the wording I've used is, I just really don't want it to be a talking shop. I actually want to do things. Of course, there is a concern that we don't always have the regulatory framework, or in fact the market in place, but we're not letting it stop us from taking the first or the second step. It may stop the 8th step, but let's not just stop now, because we don't even know the questions sometimes to say to the regulator, this is what we want different. So yeah, amazing collaboration. And I think it's somewhat being generated by this really huge problem we've got. Big problem requires kind of a big solution, and probably if we get together, we can manage the risk amongst ourselves rather than one company having to take that risk and be the first mover.
That's good. Great. Peter, there's a which from one of our participants saying the European energy majors seem to be going in a different direction than the US majors when approaching climate change. Shouldn't we all be working together for the benefit of the global community?
Well, one of the things you're always taught is not to cast aspersions on your peers in the industry. But I think it's probably fair to say that the European majors are more active in the transition than the US majors, and for whatever reason. And I know there are enormous exceptions, because there are some extraordinary things going on in with some of our colleagues in the US. But I mean, if just building a little bit on what Myrtle was saying, I mean, I'm very involved in carbon capture and storage in the UK at the moment, and that is a fantastic example, actually, of companies working together. So the particular project we're leading on is a project called Net Zero Teesside, which will be decarbonising power in the Teesside area and then transporting and storing that power offshore Humberside, and sharing a storage facility probably with another project which is coming up from Drax through Humberside. And that is, yes, it's ENI and it's Total and it's Shell, it's Equinor and it's BP, who are all European companies. So I think it is fair to say that in Europe, maybe it's because there is more government movement on the energy transition. Maybe it's because the pressures from civil society and from society in general are greater in Europe. I don't know. But I mean, Vivian, you used to run this business. I mean, it's very much in the DNA as well of a company like BP to look at becoming a low carbon company going forward. We've just had a few hiccups along the way to do with crises, either of our own making or of a general making. But I think there are some really exciting things going on, and also around the port of Rotterdam. We're all investing in things like battery technology, solar, obviously, and wind. So I think the European oil and gas companies are embracing the energy transition in a really exciting way, actually.
And the scale of the climate change challenge is such that we really need everybody to work together in order to solve these problems, don't we? There's another question for you, Peter. And certainly when I was running renewable energies inside BP, very often the challenge was, why on earth do you oil and gas companies think you're the right people to be doing all this low carbon work? This is for the new industries, for the new companies. You're just the dinosaurs.
Well, we might not be the right people. I don't think we're arrogant enough. I hope we're not arrogant enough to think this won't happen without us. But we do think that we bring something to the table. We understand energy systems. We are able to mobilize capital. We understand project management, big project management. Now, that's not to say that there aren't others out there that do it too. And there are some amazing companies in this sector, Ørsted and others who've just transformed themselves. So, no, I think there's plenty of room for everybody to play, because frankly, we're going to need pretty much all the skill sets that we've talked about, and those don't exclusively reside in an oil and gas company. So yeah, we're all in this together, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Jeremiah, there was a question, I know you put an answer, but just so others, in case others haven't seen it, but there was a question about supply chains and whether you're seeing a big shift from global supply chains to more local ones. Just give us your sense of what's happening in the supply chain environment.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's a great question, and I probably didn't articulate it straight enough in the text reply. But yes, we are seeing a big shift to local suppliers in certain regions. Just a kind of a neat side note, I had a call a couple of weeks ago with a super major, and one of their big initiatives is 3D printing. So the ability to locally 3D print from sourcing partners for certain parts. So if you can think about some of those capabilities from, the carbon footprint of the shipping of those parts, the manufacturing of those parts, now being able to be sourced locally right across the street from a 3D printer supplier, really neat, and it could transform a lot of the way this industry does business. Still a little ways to go, but yeah, so we're seeing a lot of local suppliers. We're also seeing a lot of transition and mindsets change. Like I was talking about earlier, from you typically in your upstream, you have your individual assets that are joint ventured. So you're buying inventory just for that asset, and it's owned by that asset. But you're buying the same material for another asset, and you're stocking independently. So essentially, you're carrying twice as much as you likely need. And so there's a big shift right now that my group's really pushing for with a number of other partners to try to stock for the region. And so obviously some manufacturer suppliers would reduce on some of this, but there's so much waste that's created every year on inventory that's purchased, and it sits there in certain cases for decades and is never used. And so that's really where we were really pushing right now as to, how do we kind of rethink some of this because some of those barriers now are being able to be broke down from the joint venture accounting and so forth with technologies like blockchain and so forth.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and I haven't given the panelists any warning of this question, but I'm going to ask each of the panelists to tell me, and I'm an optimist in life, not a pessimist. So I'm going to say, the question is, what would you hope the legacy of COVID-19 will be for our industry? John, I'm going to start with you.
I think just kind of echoing some of the discussion we've had before, I think one, it's an acceleration of the energy transition and a realization that, you know, we all need to pull together to actually ensure that we make as bigger and as quicker impact in that area as possible, and that actually spend goes up relative to other kind of areas rather than down. And I think too that the kind of digital transformation of our industry is accelerated as well, that we kind of get past this kind of MVP, try it out stage, and actually start to scale up some of these solutions, really put them in practice, and kind of learn while we go once they're up and live, and drive the value that way.
Peter.
Shall I come in, Vivian? I mean, I would very much agree with the things that John said. I mean, I think we are really having to look at cost in a fundamental way. So I think that means that we're looking at completely new ways of working. We're looking very differently at what is an office, what is a work environment. Why do we fly around in airplanes all the time? Do we need to do that? Yes, we do a bit, but maybe not as much as we've done before. So a real kind of fundamental kind of rethink of the way we work. And I think certainly acceleration of the digitization agenda, if that wasn't happening already, which of course it is. But I do think this time that this will accelerate the energy transition. I think people have enjoyed. I'm sitting here in Richmond in West London, and if a plane goes over now, it's sort of, wow, what's that? Whereas in the past it was a constant stream. So I just think people will get used to thinking differently about a whole number of different things. And I think governments are going to want to rebuild their economies, and they're not going to make the mistake, I think, of the past and just rebuild them in the same way. I think they might leapfrog over into kind of new spaces. So I think it's actually an extremely exciting time, and if anything, I think it probably means we're more likely to reach the Paris goals than we were maybe 12 months ago. But of course, there's a horrible toll that's been taken getting there. But I do think there is a pretty big silver lining to this big cloud.
Excellent. Myrtle.
Okay, so I think from my perspective, I think that we should probably be more confident in the future about our ability to do really big things, because if in 2019 we'd had the task of shutting down the country, it would have taken us several years to do the planning, and it would still have probably been even more painful than the process has been. So obviously this has not been a good experience for many people in terms of from an economic perspective, but the confidence about doing really big things quickly, I think that we probably do have more resilience to do that, and hence I think we can be a bit braver in some of the decisions, and a little less brittle, that it may go wrong a bit. It doesn't have to be perfect. And for me, I am still surprised and still amazed that we actually did shut down the country, and most of what needed to go on went on, and that even though we're coming out of this with I think from an economic perspective, in a where we don't want to be, we did actually manage to do a lot of things during that period, which I certainly am proud that we did things to safeguard each other's health. So I feel very optimistic, and I want us to be a bit more braver about some of the other decisions in front of us.
Perfect. Thank you. Jeremiah, word to you, please.
You broke up a little bit, Vivian. Did you say my name, Jeremiah?
Indeed. And
okay.
brief last word to you.
Sure. Yeah. So I hope we take a lot more lessons than we did from the last downturn. I think this one is way worse, in my opinion. And I think that just echo what everyone's same sentiments are, is that we really have people listening now about how to change the way the business and industry is run. I think the difference between now and the last downturn is that this has affected everybody in the world. How interconnected we truly are, and as these energy companies, we all want a cleaner, better Earth, but we have to do. It's going to take slow, incremental change to make it get there, and hopefully some of these technologies and the younger generations coming on board and being brought up, they're going to expect better. So hopefully, yeah, I'm positive. I'm optimistic.
Great. Well, it's fantastic to hear optimism from all of you, but a lot of work to be done. Let's close now. Thank you to all of the panelists and indeed to the participants for their questions. We're going to finish with the poll. So I just want you to feed in your 3 takeaways, if you will, and we'll create a word cloud. The 3 takeaways from this last hour. And once again, thank you to the panelists, thank you to the Energy Institute, and I hope you've all found this interesting.